Good afternoon, everyone. GW Law's National Security, Cybersecurity, and Foreign Relations Law Program and its student organization, National Security Law Association, welcome you to Creating National Cybersecurity Strategy, a discussion with Chris Inglis, our first National Cyber Director. This conversation will be moderated by GW Law's Visiting Associate Professor of Law and National Security, Cybersecurity, and Foreign Relations Law Fellow, Professor Lindsay Rodman. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to host and hear from Mr. Inglis. So Mr. Inglis, thank you so much for being here today. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Rodman. Professor Rodman is an expert in national security law, the law of armed conflict, and military law, and she has extensive experience studying civil-military relations, among other diverse topics in law and national security. Professor Rodman began her legal career at Arnold & Palmer, LLP, before joining the Marine Corps as an active duty JAG officer. Professor Rodman remains an officer in the reserves. On active duty, Professor Rodman worked in operational law and served as deputy legal counsel to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a White House fellow. After leaving active duty, Professor Rodman served as the special assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Professor Rodman is also a seasoned nonprofit executive. Additionally, Professor Rodman is currently transitioning to a position as Associate General Counsel for Intelligence at the Pentagon. So we wish her luck and we thank her for her dedication to GW Law's National Security Program. I would also be remiss if I didn't encourage students to take her awesome national security and professional responsibility class. It's been great, taught in the spring. So Professor Rodman, thank you for being here today, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Thanks for saying that exam grades are not in yet. But I would never suggest she's doing anything untoward because we all act very ethically in that class. I also, of course, need to do the standard DoD disclaimer. Kendall mentioned both that I am a reserve officer in the United States Marine Corps and pending employment with the Department of Defense. Nothing I say here today is speaking on anyone's behalf except for my own. But of course, I'm not actually here to do the speaking. I'm here to facilitate the speaking of Chris Inglis, who we are just absolutely delighted to have. It's really a shame that Professor Siedebaum can't be here today. He's a little bit sick, so he was not able to facilitate this conversation. But when he came to us and said, oh, you know, my friend Chris Inglis might be interested in talking to the GW Law community about the national cyber strategy, we were immediately ecstatic. I mean, it was just such a fantastic opportunity for us to have you here. As many of you know, GW Law has really been investing in cybersecurity as the way of the future in terms of law. And there are many wonderful opportunities for law students and for legal practitioners to be engaging on these really important topics. It's an area that is really important to GW in our future. So having you here is just incredible. And you know, Chris will talk to you about the national cyber strategy and everything that they were able to accomplish in government. But in order to understand that, of course, you have to understand where he came from. He's had an extraordinary career of public service, more than 45 years dedicated to making our country safer. He has far too many accomplishments and honors for me to mention in a short bio, but I'll mention 4 elements of his life and career that we thought Professor Siedebaum and I presenting this information were really indicative of his character and his abilities. The first precedes his professional life. He was an Eagle Scout, which is to say that he has been dedicated to community service, and that has marked his whole life from the very early on. My father was an Eagle Scout, and that was an important part of the value system that he passed on to us as well. The second element of Chris's career is his military service. A 1976 graduate of the Air Force Academy, he spent nearly a decade in active service as a pilot and commander, and ultimately reached the rank of Brigadier General in the Air National Guard. A third aspect of his career is as a scholar and professor. Chris received 2 master's degrees while in the military, one in mechanical engineering and one in electrical engineering. He then taught at both the Naval Academy and West Point. John has written here, not bad for an Air Force officer. I would say we got to sneak some Marine Corps experience in there, and then you get the
it takes an Air Force officer to raise a
In 1990, he also received a professional degree, which is sort of a practical PhD in computer science right here at GW. And since 2015, he's been a professor of cybersecurity studies at Annapolis. And finally, fourth, Chris spent 35 years rising through the ranks to become the deputy director at the National Security Agency, our lead signals, intelligence, cryptography, and cyber operations agency. So it was not a surprise to anyone that when Congress established the Office of National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis was the consensus choice to create and lead this new and important White House office. He was confirmed by voice vote in the Senate, and then spent 2 years undertaking many important tasks, but perhaps none more important than leading the development of the National Cybersecurity Strategy released just last month. That in itself is an incredible achievement. And so no one can speak to the strategy's creation and significance more effectively than our guest today. So please join me in welcoming him, Chris Inglis, to GW Law School.
Thank you very much. If it's all right with all of you, I might stand and pace a bit, right? So I know that that's probably not allowed in most courts of law, but I'd just be more comfortable with that. And what I'm going to try to do is to perhaps tell some aspects of the story about the development of the National Cybersecurity Strategy that cause you to perhaps question, poke, and probe, and then take the conversation through your questions. Some of the answers will come from you, some possibly from me, but take the conversation where you want it to go. That's a fair way to proceed. I know I'm a little bit long on the tooth. That's why I have a long resume. Last summer, when I was at the White House as the National Cyber Director, we brought in an array of students to serve in internships. They were all terrific. They were all just amazing. And there was a cadre there from the US Air Force Academy. And on July 3rd of 2022, the date was significant for a reason I'll tell you, I turned to them and I said, I'm just so impressed that you're here at this moment, at this time. This is such a special day. And they were kind of like pawing the ground and shucks and aha and ahem. I said, no. 50 years ago today, I showed up at the Air Force Academy. And one of them said, to do what? I said, to be a cadet. And he's like, you're kidding me. And they all reached up to try to support me before I would fall on the floor, kind of from some kind of ailment of old age. And so I've been in it for quite a long time. My first computer was a slide rule. I still have it. It still works. It actually was a 3-part play. The slide rule was one thing, pre-computed numbers and this book of mathematical tables was the second part. And your head was the third part. You had to actually put the decimal point in the right place. We've long left that sort of technology behind, but that's the technology to put a man on the moon, return him safely to the earth in the 1960s. And the fact that we now have this technology that is just racing ahead of us in ways that most of us, myself included, can't completely understand, is both a boon and a bane, right? Remember that old joke about Boris Yeltsin when he was proceeding kind of from an autocracy towards a democracy in his short kind of perhaps ill-gotten reign. But he was asked in a press conference, how's it going? And he thought that was, somewhat audacious for someone to ask him, how's it going? But it was the madding press. And after some kind of cogitation, he said, in a word, good. Right? And then somebody said, how about in 2 words, how's it going? And he said, in 2 words, not good. Which is actually a pretty fair characterization of how it's gone in cyberspace. It's going extremely well. We're doing things with it, by, with, and through it that are simply unimaginable in any other era of time. We encountered something called COVID. We diagnosed it, used a worldwide network of both scientists, data, and processing facilities to determine how to address it, brought all the research to bear and developed a vaccine in record time, months' time, and then further kind of manufactured and deployed that using a global logistics chain in equally record time. And here we are, right? Jonathan, unfortunately, has COVID today, but my confidence is that the combination of the vaccination and the therapeutics, he will be, God willing, the creeks don't rise, fine. Why? Because we have the apparatus, not least of which the technology underfoot that allows us to understand and address those problems. And yet, at this very moment, there are all manner of threats that you can describe. They show up typically in the New York Times, the Washington Post, above the fold, page A1, about once a week or so, that would cause us to think maybe this is not the unalloyed good that we think it is. So I'd like to address some of that in terms of the framing of the why, the what, the how, the who of cyberspace. What falls out of that is strategy. I think it's a pretty straightforward proposition, but unless you step back and say, why do we care about it? What is it? What do we have to do about that? And who's going to do that? You can't get to any reasonable strategy. You don't build that strategy simply from the ground up. You have to start in the middle and work your way out. I would say to the earlier point, I do feel very much at home here. not just because I got a degree here in 1990. We'd moved from slide rules to punch cards at the time. But because for 20 months while I was the national cyber director, I lived 1 block from here. The commute from Annapolis to Washington is a little bit harder than the commute from Annapolis to Boston. So I took up resident in a kind of a hall that's literally 1 block through that wall there. The Statesman, 2020 F Street. I was a college freshman again for the better part of 20 months. I forgive all of the folks that at 9 o'clock at night were rabble-rousing in the streets, all of that noise kind of making its way up to the floor that I was on. But I did feel grateful that I was in a safe community and then I could get up in the morning and 4 blocks later be at my desk and working away. So I do feel like I'm at home. So if I could start, there's a certain kind of slice of the audience that might immediately understand this, but I'm going to start with a military joke, military anecdote. Believe me, it's a safe one. I was a C-130 pilot for 22 years. That's true. I like to tell people I was happy once. And the joke is about that C-130. Anybody seen one of those things? It's a 4-engine behemoth that does intra-theater airlift, tactical airlift. It doesn't really fly. It makes enough noise to scare the ground away. But the joke runs like this. The airplane's up aloft and kind of at altitude going to somewhere, somewhere interesting. It's flying on 4 engines, proper altitude, proper speed. The pilots are now bored to tears, sitting back, waiting for the next event. And lo and behold, the next event occurs when a red light flashes on the dash, indicating that there's some problem with one of the engines. They're actually excited. This is a dirty little secret of what happens in cockpits. They want something exciting to do. This is actually filling the bill. And so they lean into that, realize that they have to shut this engine down. They do that properly. And then what you might not know is just like in a car, if you want to maximize the range, you have to slow the airplane down and you have to lower the altitude because you have a kind of a reduced power supply at the moment. So with no small amount of pride, they announced to the passengers and crew that, hey, we've had a problem with one of our engines. We shut it down. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower. Hold on to that. A little bit lower, a little bit slower. We'll be fine because the reason we have 4 engines is we can do this on 3. I'll accelerate the story. They lose a 2nd engine in much the same way. There's a trend developing here. They do the same thing. They announce to the passengers and crew, we'll be fine. We're at altitude. We already have the energy necessary to coast somewhere. But we'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower. Hang in there. Stick with us. They lose a 3rd engine, a little bit lower, a little bit slower. We think we can make it somewhere on 1 engine. At which point, somebody in the back who's really not familiar with aviation in any way, shape, or form says, well, I hope we don't lose the last engine, because if we do, we'll be up here all day. Right? Now, that's cyber in a nutshell, right? If people do the straight line extrapolation of what we've been observing, what we've been seeing, they would kind of be led to some inevitable conclusion about what that straight line extrapolation will tell them. That's by no means the case, because cyber doesn't work that way. It can't be observed at the surface and extrapolated or predicted in ways that a surface level observation without understanding the underpinnings would perhaps lead you to. So that's why I'm going to do the why, what, how, and who. Why? Why do we care about cyberspace? And I will in a minute describe what I mean by cyberspace, which is often, for some, cyber is a noun, for some it's a verb, for many it's a vexation, but I'll define what I mean by it in a second. But let me just start with why. Why would we even care about that in the first place? Anybody know who Jeff Moss is? Guy that does Black Hat, DEF CON, kind of he's wonderful in terms of his ability to articulate the why and the what of cyberspace. But he often starts his talks with this question. Why do race cars have bigger brakes? It's almost a self-evident thing. It's so simple an answer that you probably are avoiding it at the moment. Race cars have bigger brakes so that they can go faster. They don't have bigger brakes so that they can brag about their brakes. Maybe some do, but mostly they have bigger brakes so that they can go faster. We have to ask the same question about cyber. Why do we have cyber? Not for its own sake, not because we want to have bragging rights at the cyber poolside about I've got the biggest cyber that anyone has. How about you? We have cyber because it does things. We have cyber because I want to do my banking online. We have cyber because I want to do my social media online. We have cyber because I want to conduct business, reaching markets that I can't physically touch, reaching into supply chains that I can't physically reach into. I use cyber, the digital infrastructure, to reach that, to connect with that, to store information in there, to send information. I use cyber for all those purposes and a few things more. I use cyber, I use the digital infrastructure to construct, develop, deploy, defend critical functions. That electricity switch in the back of the room, which everybody in the room believes is absolutely infallible. When you switch that to one position or another, the thing you expect to happen will happen. Depends fundamentally on the digital infrastructure that is arrayed around this city and connects you to the critical infrastructure provider. We conduct elections using digital infrastructure. The case between Fox News and Dominion should not take away in any way, shape, or form the confidence we have that digital infrastructure is kind of up to speed. It can, in fact, fill the bill. But all that digital infrastructure that we have, we care about not for its own sake, but so that we can do the things we already care about. In my view, in my world, I would put cyber in its proper place, not by elevating it and saying it's important in its own right, but by subordinating it, saying it's already important to the things that we care about. Therefore, everybody that cares about the kinds of functions that I just described, which is probably everyone in the room, should say, I do care about cyber. I didn't realize it, but I do care about cyber in the way that I care about clean air and fresh water and all those other essential commodities that essentially make it possible for me to live the life that I want to live. If that's why we care about cyber, and you can kind of challenge that later kind of in the Q&A session, what is it, right? Now, for many people, cyber is this vexing pile of technology. One thing kind of coming after another. I tell that story about the slide rule, not to make you feel sorry about my origin story, but to make the point that what happened between 1972 when I got that slide rule and the present day, 51 years later, is probably going to happen again in the next 5 years, or the next 3 years, or the next 2 years. The technology is accelerating. Whatever you're holding on to now to attach yourself to digital infrastructure is going to change dramatically. It's going to be transformed in a period of time that will kind of make your head spin. So that technology onrush is inexorable, impressive, and perhaps mind-boggling in a way that we really can't get our arms around it, which is why we have this fixating gaze at technology and think that it's all of cyber. That's the whole play, right? The devices, the connectivity, the data sets, all of that sometimes stands in as that's cyberspace. It's not. It's only one piece of cyberspace, the most visible piece. There are two other pieces that are really important. I think lawyers would get this immediately. The second piece of cyber, and I'm going to mention these in the reverse order that I think they're important. The second piece of cyber is people. It's not the people who are unimportant. I'm talking about the role that people play. I'm talking about the skills that they bring to bear. That the choices people make about how they use digital infrastructure, the internet or cyber, actually define the outcomes to a much greater degree than the technology itself does. Most technologists are surprised at the manner in which people use their technology. There are all sorts of kind of surprises about when somebody picks something up and kind of doesn't read the user's manual. Nobody does. And they employ it in a way that nobody had ever thought about. That's where innovation and creativity come from. Some of that's an unalloyed good. Some of that is actually kind of scary in terms of, I've never intended for you to use your online access to control the kind of the flow of chemicals to the water supply in South Florida. I never intended for you to do that. And yet they do that. People actually are a part of cyberspace. The choices they make implicate cyber futures. And unless they're properly skilled in understanding what those choices will result in, we're off to the races in a way that's not helpful. And most of us, to be candid, are not digital natives. We're app natives. I know how to download the app. I know how to make it work. I know how to make it dance on top of the infrastructure. But ask me where the cloud is, it's not a question that's of interest to me. I don't care. It's out there somewhere. And when I put stuff in it, stuff generally comes back from it. But if you're a business and you've got life-critical information or you've got competitively critical information, you stick it into the cloud assuming that somebody there has actually provided protection for it. But that's not in the contract. And the cloud provider doesn't have any kind of desire or commitment to take on your liability, then you're going to be wholly disappointed when you realize that somebody else has reached into that, extracted your secrets, and used those in a way that you find inappropriate. You don't need everybody to be Python programmers, whatever that is, but we do need people to be digitally smart in the same way that they know how to buy a car and they know how to ask, what's that light on the dashboard doing? They know that they should put their hands at the 10 and 2 o'clock position. They can still drive drunk. I wouldn't recommend it, but they have enough knowledge to know how to actually engage this device and the systems within which that device operates to actually participate in their own defense. The third part, the most important part, and will lead me directly to what perhaps I think is the big deal about the strategy. The third part of cyberspace is what I would describe kind of in a military context as doctrine, but simply put, it's the assignment of roles and responsibilities. Do we know who is accountable for what? Such that if you're a participant in this kind of ecosystem, you have an expectation, you know what the party to the left of you, you know what the party to the right of you. I'm not talking about city planning of the sort that Vladimir Lenin would be proud of. I'm just talking about, do you have any general kind of understanding of who's accountable for what in terms of the creation of fundamental resilience and the sustainment of that resilience? in terms of if there's a crisis of some defined sort, do we know who's going to stand into the center and essentially pick up the microphone and deal with that? Or, as is too often the case in cyberspace, is the user at the end of that whip chain the first and last point of defense for a system that actually hasn't had any inherent resilience or robustness built in? Let me give two cases in point to kind of like emphasize what I just said about the three parts of cyberspace. Anybody remember SolarWinds? SolarWinds, company in Texas that kind of manufactured software, deployed that software through various resellers, sometimes directly. And if you bought that software, you would have thought that its ostensible purpose was to help you manage a very complicated local environment. Tell you what devices you have in your environment, what the status of those devices are they patched? You probably would have been led without too much convincing to think that it's a security software. It doesn't actually help you in the functions of your business directly, but it helps you make sure that the devices you deploy in your business are essentially up and running and kind of in the best shape possible. And that you understand something about the nature of your actual network as opposed to the network you might have thought you had when you arrived in the morning. What was really interesting about that is the Russian government got into SolarWinds at the factory in Texas. Now, somebody might later ask me, why didn't NSA catch that? I think all the lawyers in the room know why NSA wouldn't catch that and why you wouldn't want NSA to catch that in Texas. Anyway, so they got into the factory at Texas and they flowed down that supply chain all the way through the resellers, all the way through the value enhancers to the end customers. And they essentially kind of just like a Trojan horse were sitting inside of that software and using it for surveillance purposes or business, competitive intelligence businesses purposes. And what I found remarkable about that is when a few weeks later and this whole thing broke and everybody realized that this software wasn't performing the way they thought it should, CEO of the company shows up, I think testifying before Congress, and said something to the effect of, in the future, we want to be known as a security company. You had to look over your shoulder at that point to say, well, what were you before? They probably didn't make any false pretenses. I'm not actually alleging that there's a case to be had there, but that was not a technology failure. That was not a singular people failure. It was a doctrinal failure. Nobody was responsible for defending that supply chain. Not at the factory, not in the value enhancement that occurred all the way down that supply chain. And certainly the customer, the user at the end didn't think that they were the accountable party. They thought they were inheriting something that was already built in. It's a doctrinal failure. It's a fundamental doctrinal failure. If I remember the Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline, Russians again, but in this case, it's a Russian criminal gang. They're trying to get into a system that's developing and delivering petroleum products up and down the eastern seaboard. And they got into the administrative side of Colonial Pipelines. That's where you do accounts receivable, new accounts, who owes what to whom, what deliveries have to be made. And at that point where it detected, good news, they were about to launch probably a ransomware attack. We'll encrypt your stuff, hold it at risk. You've got to pay us in order to get us out of the system. And the first responders show up and they said, is your administrative system connected to your operational system, the pipes, the valves, the motors that deliver petroleum to the end customers? And the answer was, I don't know. I have no idea, right? I'm not sure I know the architecture myself as well as I might. At which point the advice and counsel was, we'll shut the whole thing down. What began as an attack on the data and the systems of the administrative side, which could have transgressed in the operational side, quickly became an attack, not just on the delivery of a critical function to millions of Americans up and down the eastern seaboard, became an attack on confidence. 10 million Americans kind of had the moral equivalent of a hurricane in cyberspace thinking I need to rush to the store and buy all the white bread off the shelves. They all flooded, rushed to the gas stations up and down the eastern seaboard, lining up for petroleum that was still in the pipeline. They could have been dispensed from that pipeline. There was not a commodity supply issue there. It was a confidence issue. One single error by an individual who clicked on a link that they shouldn't have, failed to configure a virtual private network underneath of that the way they should have. One single error led to the defeat of the confidence of millions of people. It's a completely inappropriate ratio. It should be just the reverse. It should be that millions of us can participate in the defense of one of us. So think about those two premises that I just gave you. Doctrine was the issue in SolarWinds. A single error of a person led to a magnified effect in terms of Colonial Pipeline. Those two issues must be addressed. We have to get people skills into the right place. We get to role assignments in the right place. And my view is that doctrine is the thing that's most wanting. People skills come close behind, and the technology should follow. We shouldn't be suborning or prostrating ourselves at the altar of technology. I'm a big technologist. I've been a technologist my whole life. But we should actually be telling the technologists, these are the properties of the systems that we want, that we need. We should allow market forces to essentially deliver a certain amount of that, self-enlightenment to deliver a certain amount of that. But then at that point, having kind of run the gamut as hard and fast as we can, we need to be in a place like we have for transportation systems, for therapeutics, for drugs. We need to be in a place where we say, but there's a non-discretionary attribute of this critical system that provides health, life, and safety critical services that's not discretionary and must then be dealt with. So the strategy. The strategy essentially comes from the following place. One has a very positive, kind of compelling declaration of what the internet, what cyberspace does for us. It imagines implicitly that it's comprised of not just technology, but role assignments and people skills. Having said that, it says we must do three things broadly. You won't find this in the chapters of the document, but this is essentially the underlayment. It says we need to make it an inherently resilient and robust kind of enterprise. We need to do that in a way that makes it defensible. It will never be secure, right? That's something you won't find that written in the document. That's too negative a statement, but it will never be secure. But it can be made defensible. And it can be made defensible in a way that we can then use it with a very bold and positive aspiration for what we're going to do with it. The next vaccination, climate change, living your lives, doing all the things you want to do to make your life more efficient with a considerably reduced set of resources that you have to deploy. So make it defensible, actually defend it. And defend it in a way where you got to beat more of us, if not all of us, to beat one of us. Make it a collective defense, a collaborative defense, as opposed to everyone's defending in their silo. Because that's the way it works today, right? We kind of are all waiting for a cyber Pearl Harbor to occur. My view is that it is occurring. It's happening all around us. It's just diffused in time and space that we haven't actually seen that thing that went down well to my right is connected to that thing that went down well to my left. And I'm just on the same strand, but I haven't felt it at the moment. We haven't had that collective cathartic experience that says that cyber Pearl Harbor that would motivate us to get serious about this and to do something about that. We shouldn't be waiting for it. We should acknowledge that it's already occurred, right? Make it defensible, actually defend it, do it in a collective fashion, and have that collective defense be in the largest possible venue, the international venue. This is the work of nations, plural, a whole of nation within any one of them, but nations, plural. So what's the strategy do? It makes two big moves. First big move that the strategy makes is it says, hey, if you believe all of that is the underlayment, the foundations, then we need to make some role assignments that properly kind of give responsibility and attendant accountability to the parties that are most able to bear this burden. Not because they have the coffers, but because they're at that point of leverage where they and they alone could essentially make the investments necessary to create the inherent resilience and robustness of the systems that we then inherit. Think cloud providers, think major software providers, think the infrastructure providers who do the development, not just the operation. Most regulation, most compliance kind of attaches today to operators, which are they're much too far down the line to actually make the kind of high leverage changes that are required to get this into a better place. This is not without precedent, right? Cars, when I was a kid, did not, for the most part, have seatbelts. An air safety bag was like this, this kind of phenomenon that might be kind of 50 years into the future. The inherent safety and resilience of the car was left to market forces. I can still remember, you might not remember these commercials, but ask your parents. I can still remember when Volvo started crashing perfectly good cars into the wall and showing that the dummies inside survived. I was like, what's that all about? That's market forces kind of saying safety matters to the end consumers. And Volvo would say that if you want a safe car for your family that you're kind of raising kind of in an otherwise dangerous world, buy us. That married with the US government and others, states as well, standing in to say, we're not going to let this be simply done by market forces or self-enlightenment alone. We're actually going to make some requirements. I think it was Elizabeth Dole, who was Secretary of Transportation, said, you may not access, the states may not access the Highway Transportation Fund unless you have a seatbelt law, unless you actually put something on the books that requires that we have seatbelts. So we actually take care of it at the device level. We take care of it at the doctrinal level. And the kind of the marriage of those two things with some amount of compellence from the federal government got us across the line where now I think most people say that's just a natural part of getting in a car. Put your seatbelt on. Hands at 10 and 2 o'clock position, seatbelt on, make sure the air safety bag's still working. I don't have to go to an aftermarket separate sales room in order to get the car in the right place. And the road systems are a part of it as well. Somebody's taking care to make sure that the road systems have standards that are both for purposes of efficiency across those roads, but safety across those roads. Lanes have a certain standard width across the nation's federal highways. Bridges have a certain standard height. Any kind of hazards on the road are taken care of because there's a cadre that essentially says, at the highest point of leverage, I'll deal with that by concentrating that responsibility in the hands of a few, who then make the road systems, who make the doctrine, the policing of those road systems, a matter of allocation of responsibility broadly across the ecosystem. It's as natural and right as rain for us in terms of transportation or on airplanes or in drugs or therapeutics. Cyber should be, could be, must be no different, because cyber is even more existential to the conduct of our lives. Because the things under attack in cyberspace are not just data and systems, the critical functions that depend on them and the confidence that depends on that. And who amongst us wants to get up tomorrow morning and shy away from doing that next bold positive aspiration because we're not sure that cyberspace is going to be there for us. First big move, allocate responsibility to those who can bear it. Second big move is incentivize resilience by design as opposed to resilience by reaction. What do I mean by that? Computer scientists in the room, and maybe those who've studied this closely would say, I remember in December of about 2021, I think it was, that this thing, the log4j happened, which is this open source software library. Imagine you're a programmer and you want to write a software routine that at some point has to calculate the area of a circle. That's been done about 1 billion times. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a library somewhere you could just say, I need the calculation of a circle kind of software. Just pull that kind of module out and stick it into your software. Imagine the kind of software that's been written for a broad array of purposes living in something called log4j. Turns out that log4j, which has been crowdsourced forever, probably 40 years, had some inherent flaws, some vulnerabilities in it that just came along for the ride. Why? Because the software programmers were building primary functions. They didn't think that it was their job to ensure that it was devoid of any flaw or vulnerability that might one day be discovered and exploited by somebody else. Nobody was accountable for the security, the resilience of that library. So we discovered that in December of about 2021, and everyone's hair was on fire. And for the next month, month and a half, I can remember within the federal government and across the larger private sector, it was all hands to the wheel. And we did a magnificent job, I'm happy to say. It's not that those vulnerabilities don't still exist out there. Some of them still do. But it didn't become the disaster we thought it might because we reacted so extraordinarily well. But if we did log4j response that way, perfectly, time after time after time, my view is it just moves more slowly. It's just a race to the bottom in a more slow spiral. We have to get to where we actually build that stuff to be inherently resilient and robustness up front. We need to create the incentives, many of which are cultural in nature. Now, I was in my first life as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, trained as a mechanical engineer, meaning the world was objectively determinable, right? Given, kind of fine, kind of assumptions, the answer in the bottom, generally plus or minus 1%, the same answer all the time. And the systems I was expected to develop, and that I might have if I'd gone out and been a commercial mechanical engineer, only had to deliver that primary function. If I had built a system in 1972, 1976, saying nothing about the quality of my education, but if I'd had to build a system in those years that, as a byproduct, spewed toxins into the nearby river, or spewed kind of carbofluorins into the atmosphere, and all manner of other things, not my problem, right? So I had a very narrow discipline, and there wasn't this kind of engineering ethics that was overlaid on top of that to say, yeah, but you need to make sure that what you do is ecologically sensitive, that it actually does not have a negative impact. Right? There wasn't the kind of rule that kind of surgeons or doctors have of first do no harm, right? That's all changed. That's all changed dramatically because we see that nothing that you do after you build a system like that can mitigate the effects that have the highest possible leverage at the point of design. So we've taken it all the way back, and in the classrooms, we teach today's mechanical engineers and all manner of other engineers. You need to make sure that what you do not just meets the primary functions that you're after, the things that are visible above the waterline, but actually has a positive effect on the environment, positive effect in the ethics of the situation, and so on and so forth. You all know what that means because I think now it's natural, it's reflexive. But we don't do that with coders, right? Coders still kind of have bragging rights. If they have the sharpest, fastest, kind of quickest code, be damned as to what the kind of the rest of the specs are. It's not to say that any of that is illicit or kind of mean-spirited. It's just to say that it's not their responsibility. I met a computer science grad from a very reputable institution about 6 months ago and said, got a degree in computer science? Yeah. Have you thought about going into cyber? God, no. No way. I want to stay about 15 million miles away from that. He's in he's in cyber science. He's in cyber resilience. If he doesn't think that that's an attendant responsibility of his, then he's off the rails. So second big shift is, how do we incentivize people to feel like that? How do we actually build that into the culture, doctrine? How do we build that into the people skills, right? Awareness. And how do we build that into the technology? Through incentives as much or more as through regulatory forces. Let me just say one thing more about the sum of those two, about assigning responsibility across the ecosystem and about kind of incentivizing resilience right up front. Oftentimes at this moment, the ugly R word comes in, like, oh, you're going to regulate your way to success. At some point, regulation is going to stand in, as it has in other domains of interest. But regulation used for its own sake, used in and of itself as only this cudgel, this kind of blunt force instrument, is almost never helpful. Right? Regulation has to be done in context. It needs to allow market forces, self-enlightenment to play out. It needs to make sure that it takes full advantage of those that are to be regulated. So there has to be a high degree of consultation with the experts who actually understand how the technology and the doctrine comes together to deliver some function of interest. And so a high degree of consultation, which is different than saying give veto power to those who will be regulated, but give them the opportunity to say, these are the points of influences that you need to actually think your way through. And it needs to be done in a way that you rationalize and harmonize that. If you're a bank in the United States now, you're probably regulated by 5, 10, 14 different entities, and not just different in kind, but different in jurisdiction. 54 states and territories, probably operating abroad, so the EU stands in, and so on and so forth. They're crying out for, look, we realize that there should be some non-discretionary attributes of the systems that we deploy, but we could use a little help here. We could actually use a little help in the supply chain in terms of acquiring material that has built-in resilience and robustness. We can use a little help in rationalizing the various overseers that we find. So we're being asked by party A to do thing 1 and party B to do thing 2. They both have noble intended goals associated with them, but they're different. They're profoundly different. And so can you help us perhaps do that rationalization? I think if regulation's done in that context, it's done when necessary, but not before it's necessary, with the lightest possible touch, done with a high degree of consultation, done with rationalization foremost in mind, I think it can be a very useful life force. But it requires a collaboration between the governors and the governed, right? It requires that we get that right that way. There's a whole lot else in the strategy that perhaps your questions will kind of pluck and probe at. I would just say that the strategy is organized in 5 pillars. You could organize it 56 ways, but we chose to do it by 5 pillars so that we can make some demonstrative statements about what perhaps the underpinnings of this were. I'll just call out 2 of them right up front. One describes market forces as a really important kind of life force, right, to kind of take advantage of. To make it clear that this can't be done by the government, by fiat, can't be done by prescription or prescription. And another, the international pillar is really important because remember what I said, that the coalition you bring to bear has to be done in the largest possible context. If it's not done in the international context, then it's just one hand clapping and that never makes enough noise to make a difference. All right, so that's a down payment on that. I think we have some time for quite a few questions. I'll be happy to take them. And if you have answers, I'll take them too. Who's first? Yes, sir.
Eric Snyder, a student here. I also work at CISM.
God bless you.
I'd like to ask you about your current job. Educating people. There isn't a sense out there that there's a duty of care as to what the average person administering a system needs to be, the person buying a cybersecurity device, or some degree of the person using it, as you mentioned. So what can we do as a society to establish what the minimum duty is of any of those people and the standard to which they should be trained before they use the more sophisticated equipment?
Yeah, so you may know this, and I'm confident that you and your organization are contributing fully to this. But the next thing to come down after the National Cybersecurity Strategy is a national workforce education, cyber workforce education strategy. And contrary to kind of original expectations, it's actually going to take on all of it, not just some of it. And what do I mean by that? It's going to have an all component. It's going to have a many component. It's going to have a few component. I'll describe them in reverse order. It's going to take on the few disciplines that actually require deep and sharp IT and cyber skills. Right? We know who they are because typically the word IT or the words IT or cyber show up in the job titles. Turns out that crowd, the few crowd in my parlance, about 1/3 of the jobs that require those deep and sharp skills are empty at the moment. So we have to fill those jobs in addition to making sure that the 2/3 are in there have some common standards as you've described. And we need to readdress everything about how we even consider those jobs. That figure now is somewhere on the order of 500,000 people in the United States. It doesn't matter whether you're in the government, the private sector, it's about 1/3 short, right? And so how do we actually then address that? We need to first figure out what are the skills that are required, to your point. It turns out that technology skills are important, possibly essential, but not the most important. In my view, the best CISO is somebody that's got good common sense skills and can bring to bear disparate disciplines in a combined collaborative way to address the problem. They actually leverage and tap the skills of many different disciplines in order to pull off the defense of a piece of infrastructure. And so do we actually emphasize that when we hire the next CISO, or do we say, nope, I need a computer science degree with 4 years experience? Who graduates from college with both a computer science degree and 4 years of hands-on experience? No one that I know of. So how do we actually kind of address what are those skills that are really necessary? And how do we make sure that from the aspiration that somebody might have to the destination that we intend, we help them along that track? So where are the co-op programs? Where are the practical experience programs? Where are the deployment programs that essentially help us fill those positions? That's the few. And to your point, along the way, we need to describe what really is required in those jobs. There's a many problem, which there are many in this room, right? So lawyers actually make choices all day, every day that implicate cyber futures. CEOs who come out of MBA programs make choices all day, every day that implicate cyber futures, and so on and so forth. And yet, the curricula for them, largely developed over millennia, doesn't attend to those digital skills. They consider that, hey, you were raised in the presence of this stuff. You're a digital native. You can figure this out now. Most of us can't find the settings button on our on the next iPhone, or within that where the general kind of features are, and within that which apps are drawing more power than not from that. Well, maybe you can, but most people can't, right? And so they just have not got the skills. So we need to reach into those curricula and say, you need to know something more about cyber or this digital infrastructure than you might know. At the US Naval Academy, they make every midshipman, every student, doesn't matter whether you're an English major, you can still major in English. Whether you're a legal studies major, whether you're a nuclear engineer, you need to take 2 courses in cyber. It's a sin against humanity for most of them. Like, I did not sign up for this. No, actually, you signed up for the United States Navy, right? So this is part of the deal. And what they learn in that is not how to program in Python, but they learn what are the consequences of choices they make in a world dependent upon digital infrastructure. Absolutely essential, right? Absolutely essential. And then there's the awe, right? I've already made that case that we teach our kids more about hot stoves and crossing city streets than we do about cyber, right? They don't know what happens when they click on a link, except that generally something exciting happens. And they don't realize it's somebody else's code, whatever that is. What is code? And their permissions, whatever that is. We need to help them understand what that marriage kind of results in. It can sometimes be a very heavy consequence, but sometimes not. And my bet is that parents at the dinner table are more often than not talking about how to duck and cover. It's a sad moment. Talking about how to cross a city street, talking about how to manage a hot stove, and almost never talking about kind of the digital infrastructure. Why? Because it's off-putting to them. And they just assume that their kids are smarter about that than they are, and they already feel dumb. They don't want to bring it up. So we need to address that. So the strategy will attack all 3 of those things. And I think it's really, really, really important. We get the doctrine right, but we don't get the people skills right. The technology doesn't matter a bit. Doesn't matter a bit. Is that the question, guys? So others.
I've got a few prepared for you too, if you're interested. Could you talk a little bit about how the strategy has been received by industry, by Congress, by the government agencies?
I'm not impartial on the matter, but I think I'm fair-minded. I think generally well. Why do I say that? No one has said it's a sin against humanity. Nobody has said this can't stand. This is just a pile of just loosely constructed words. Let's just trash the whole thing. Some have described it as perhaps everything, everywhere, all at once, right? That it's too comprehensive. I take that as a badge of honor. Yes, we have a deficit of so many things that we've not done. We should lay them all out. We should then properly order them in the implementation plan, kind of what are we going to do now? What are we going to do then? How are we going to do this concurrently? But there's a role to be played by everyone in the room, and I mean the big room that this thing is done in. I would tell you the following, which is a predicate to the answer to the question, which is in the development of that strategy, we started on day 1 by saying that we want to pass the art museum test. And that test essentially is loosely defined as you're in a room that's got all these portraits in it, and there may be 300 people dispersed around the room, and everybody's looking at this one portrait, and they all say, it's looking at me. It's kind of painted in a way that everybody in the room is convinced that it's looking at them. right? We wanted to pass that test. And so how do you pass that test? You do that not by at the end, kind of with all the exhortation you can muster saying, this is your strategy. You need this strategy. You want this strategy. You should love this strategy. You do that at the very beginning by saying, I've got a blank sheet of paper. I'm about to write this strategy. What are your needs? What are your aspirations? What are your wants? So there were 400 different engagements. In many cases, those engagements were consortia or consolidators in and of themselves. Think U.S. Chamber of Commerce, think the Tri-Sector Council, think kind of broad swaths of academia. But there were upwards of 400 different engagements before that thing got to the president for signature. So that hopefully, if not everyone, many people would say, that's my strategy, right? You've essentially taken my influence. Now, not everybody got their 10 words in here, but you would make the case of, hey, I've listened to them. This is what I did with them. I've influenced the strategy in this way. These are the puts and takes I've made, so that you make that explanation. So you don't have to do that in the aftermarket. You do that in the pre-market. Which meant that when we rolled that out, we had an expectation, a hope, and an expectation of any number of people that would say, that's our strategy, we just rolled out there. And they'd look around the room for somebody to raise their hand and object and say, I want to talk to you, because the thing I care about is in there. What's most interesting to me is that the regulation aspects of it have not been strongly and dramatically rebuffed by the private sector. What they've said is if you do this in context, and I know I'm kind of treating this as a monolithic kind of entity, they're not by any means, they're at various places in the map. But by and large, what they've said, even the Chamber of Commerce has said, we recognize that some non-discretionary features have to be specified and delivered. We also, though, believe that that must be done using market forces fully, using a degree of consultation with us as the ombudsman for the private sector entities that are deep and sharp, and that rationalization has to be a piece of that. So I think I would say so far, so good. The Hill has been, there's been a small bit of political rhetoric, but no more than what you would normally expect. By and large, there are some very thoughtful congressmen, senators up there, irregardless of whether they're in the Republican or the Senate party, that have said, I want to know more. Right? So come up and talk to us about that so that we can know what we could do to support it. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Director Inglis, thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Arjun Singh. I'm also a 1L student over here in the evening. With respect to the first question, you talked about education and how that needs to happen at 3 levels. But as you also mentioned, the equivalent of Pearl Harbor in terms of cybersecurity is happening right now, which means that these skills are needed right now by people presently in government. And the education system is not going to change and they're done with their education. So how do people in those positions get the kind of knowledge that they need to respond to these challenges? Do they all need to go back to school, or is there another avenue that they can avail of so that the government can be prepared for what it's facing?
That's a really good question. I don't have a single all-encompassing sweeping answer to it. I would just say it's probably a multiplicity of things. One, we need to know where we really are. Let's actually describe it, as it really is. I was on the Solarium Commission. We spent some pains and effort up front in that to say, here's where we really are. We're not where we might think we are, right? This infrastructure is fragile, it's at risk, it's in peril, and yet we have these bold and positive aspirations. Both of those, remember my not good and good kind of commentary from Boris Yeltsin, both of these things are true at the same time. Let's understand where we really are too. Let's make sure that everybody understands who's going to solve this problem. There's not some cadre of champions lurking in the corner that all have IT or cyber in their job title. They're going to sweep in and solve this, fix this in one bold maneuver. We're going to fix this. So I sometimes stand in front of an audience and say, who in the room has cyber responsibilities? And I ask that question again and again and again until every hand in the room goes up. Every one of us has a responsibility. In the same way that I say, who in the room has a responsibility for auto safety, transportation safety? At some point you realize, yeah, I've got a role to play in that. So let's get that on the table so that we can then achieve some degree of concurrency in the application of all that time and talent. But that concurrency can be chaotic unless you understand what the larger frame of reference is, why the strategy is important. These are the various things we need to do, right? And they are implicitly complementary if we do them according to what each of these pieces talks about. But we shouldn't do them in sequence. We should do them concurrently. And then the third thing that I would mention is that there's nothing like a little bit of exercising or kind of thought experimentation to kind of like walk in to really get a sense of the muscle memory required to actually navigate the present or the immediate future. So what I tell boards is you should run a cyber exercise and nobody gets a pass. CEO can't say, oh, taking my kids, taking my grandkids to the movies that day and that's a promise I can't break. we'll do it on some other day, right? You have to be there because there's almost always that moment in the middle of that exercise, a true exercise, where somebody says, well, I don't want to live that future. I don't want that to happen. Good. Turns out we have a time machine. We can go back to the moment before this thing actually occurred, like now. And you can make the investments required to avoid that future, or you can develop the muscle memory necessary to figure out what you're going to do in that future. The truth of the matter is none of the exercises actually predict what's actually going to happen, but they give you a sufficient sense of the territory, right, the landscape, that you actually have the muscle memory necessary to make some kind of choices inside of that. And the future is not so dire as some would portray it. Think about the Ukrainian example, right? They have a terrible technical architecture. I don't mean to kind of denigrate what they've got. I mean, they've done yeoman's work, but it's not the technical architecture or the technology architecture that you'd say, if I'm going to go toe-to-toe with the Russians, this is what I want. I'm going to buy it off the A list, and I got all the money in the world. They don't have that luxury. But they have this extraordinary expertise on top of that, where they understand that architecture better than the Russians do. They have a degree of agility and a delegated set of initiatives to the people who defend that, such that they can bob and weave in the presence of that. They can achieve that maneuverability on top of that. And they've got one thing more, which is they've got a coalition. The Russians find themselves having to beat the Ukrainians, Microsoft, ESET, Cisco, Elon Musk, Starlink terminals, NATO, the United States, and so on and so forth. Right? They've applied doctrine and people skills in a way that make up for that lack of technology. So there actually is quite a lot we can do if we don't change a single thing in the technology base. There's quite a lot we can already do. And I would offer one further thing, which is while I say that there's a Pearl Harbor taking place all around us at the moment in time, those are really comprised of a whole bunch of one-shot wonders. Right? It's really hard to mount a sustained campaign kind of to the detriment of some kind of victim in cyberspace, because it requires some degree of synchronized surveillance, some degree of a synchronized fire, some degree of ability to do real-time battle damage assessment, some ability to have people on the front lines that are kind of engaged in the attack who synchronize, who use their initiative, but they have some coherence in terms of what they're trying to do. It's harder than it looks, which is why the Russians have been so poor at it. They don't have any of those advantages, least of which is displaying or delegating initiative to their attackers. So I think defense can be the new offense in this space. It doesn't require technology as much or more as it requires expertise and doctrine. And we should just get serious about mobilizing all the resources our society can bring to bear. We can actually handle this. I remember when President Biden, about halfway through the Ukrainian crisis, which is by no means over, got up and I'll just roughly paraphrase this and spoke to the cyber aspects of this, saying that we're aware, right, that Russia has cyber tools in their arsenal and that they might bring those to bear against us. They should be on notice that that would be a really bad idea, but we're aware of them. We understand what their tools are. We understand what their targets might be, and we've therefore apprised those parties of it. And we're working closely with those critical sectors to make sure that they're properly aware on the front balls of their feet and that we will appropriately respond to that. So all of that, I think, was very appropriate. Part deterrence, part kind of stealing the nerves from building a coalition. But the last part of what he said was, and if that were to happen, we'll work our way through it. We will get through this, right? It might be a difficult day. It might be that just like in a thunderstorm, the lights go off. I'm kind of paraphrasing more than I should here. But there will be consequences attended to that, but we can figure it out. Bolstering the confidence of people who might otherwise think that we're about to enter into the apocalypse because the light switch didn't work immediately when I wanted it to work. No. We've done this before, and we can do this again. And so I think that we can actually be in a much better place right now if we understand who's accountable, what roles we can all play, how do we get a coherent framework to apply those things, and let's leverage expertise and doctrine as we call for that technology, which is slow to the mark. Is that the question you've asked? Joe.
Bit of a follow-up to that question. There are 4,000 little regional banks. One of the beauties of our economy that you don't find in Europe. I had a CIO, one of these without the bank, tell me he's not unsophisticated, off the food chain, but he's good. He said the three biggest banks reportedly are spending annually $500 million in cybersecurity. Our little bank is doing $700 million startup, good bank, doing well. I can't begin. We're protecting ourselves, but I have no knowledge or visibility to what that $500 million line, what of that we can spend about most. just for cybersecurity. He said there are dozens of scores and scores of companies out there that advertise.
Thousands.
Where does he or a person like him, where should they go to be able to do that which is affordable?
Yep, I think he's exactly right. If you didn't hear the question was, are all these kind of relatively small businesses that are viable businesses, but they don't have the wherewithal that a Bank of America has to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in cybersecurity. What do we do for them? Back to the kind of original proposition here, which is, if that person were here, I might put them at rest by saying, how much time do you spend doing original creative research on air safety bags or seat belts or anti-lock brakes? None, because that's built in upstream. When I buy the car, it's already there. There should be the equivalent of that for the systems that they buy. How much time do you spend actually when you're going to drive 10 miles to your child's school tomorrow, or the bus is going to drive your child 10 miles to school tomorrow? You personally survey those roads and make sure that the hazards have been removed. There are no drunk drivers, there's no speeding, there's no kind of jagged edges, none. Because that's all taken care of by those that can bear that burden. We've not done that in cyberspace, such that those small concerns that should not spend an inordinate amount of time on creating resilience that should be created upstream or sustaining that resilience through the application of high leverage activities, we should actually install those so that when they buy something, they buy a pound of the cloud. I know we don't do it that way, but they buy a pound of the cloud. It's got resilience and robustness built in. And they have some confidence that there's a significant transgressor that's holding that at risk, their pound and all the other pounds in the world. Somebody's going to stand in and deal with that. Right? Now, they have to participate in their own defense the same way they have to participate in safe driving. Right? There's a role for them to play, and that cannot be absolved. You can't rule that away. But right now, the user, those users you've spoken with, they're the first and last point, not just of defense, the operational aspect of it, but the creation of resilience and robustness. That is insane. That's a technical word. That's insane. That will never work. Right? And calling on them to do what Jamie Dimon does, and he does it well, to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on security, that will never scale. Never. Yes. Okay, good. There
Hi.
and then there.
Yeah, Raj Boya, IT background, planning to pursue cybersecurity certificate. I was recently speaking to a bunch of students from a community college in the DC area, and they are so discouraged because every company that they apply for asks for experience. So are there any incentives that the government can provide to companies to encourage them to provide more internships? Because if nobody gives them an opportunity, they're going to not have any experience.
I couldn't agree with you more. So to this day, the federal government's kind of standard answer of when I hire somebody that's going to stand into a role that requires computer science skills is I want some degree of consequence, whatever that might be, and experience to go hand in glove with that. It's crazy, because it's hard to do both of those in a formal program that's actually aiming you towards the certification or the skill set. So we need to either relax the burden of the experience and say, we'll give that to you. What I'm going to hire is your aptitude, and I will then train you, right, to get you up to speed. That's increasingly happening. Or we need to install programs that naturally do that kind of between, remember what I said earlier, aspiration to destination. Last summer, we had a summit for education at the White House. The secretaries of Labor and Commerce stood up and said, as a component of that, we're going to put on the street a fast track application process for internships, cyber internships, to make it a lot easier for a business to essentially kind of set one up. Liability requirements are reduced. The incentives from the federal government were installed. And I think the last time I looked at that, I think something on the order of, I'm in the right neighborhood, but 400 internships, which are affecting thousands of students along that track, have been stood up. That's a drop in the bucket, but it's in the right direction. So we need to do that. That workforce education strategy that I talked about has to actually address that bridge. How do we get from the moment somebody starts down that track to where they kind of come out with that skill, that certificate in hand, to where they have the requisite experience or confidence that whoever's going to employ them says, I'll provide that. Right? Because it's just crazy for us to say we're 500,000 people short, and I'm not going to take you because you don't have hands-on experience. There's some wonderful programs out there. They've not been scaled. University of Nevada, Las Vegas has one. So they'll take all the local IT students, computer science students, marry them up with local businesses who didn't know they had a cyber problem. They thought they had a how do I find enough dough to make pizza tonight problem. But they have online accounts for their kind of principal customers. They having to protect credit cards and all that sort of thing. Put those two together and you have the happiest of possible marriages. So I agree with you. Maybe this question? How are we doing on time? Are we about?
Yeah, we're going to 1:30. If
Oh, 1:30, excellent, good.
Hi, sir. So I did IT programming before I went to law school. Now currently part-time LLM student. Question on your thoughts or predictions on how AI will impact either the technology portion, the people portion, or the doctrine portion.
In a word, good. 2 words, not good. It's been ever thus, right? So it's actually going to have very positive impacts. It can have unduly negative impacts. To be sure, you're not going to put it back in the box, right? It's out of the box. It's on its way. I think today, AI is probably more heuristics. There's just very advanced algorithms that kind of operate at a speed and scale that it's dazzling us. It looks like magic. True AI and a sentient kind of entity inside of that's not here yet. But to be sure, the massive application of analytics and kind of aggregation of information to come up with insights, it's underway. And we need to, I think, do 2 things. One, we need to make sure that we're researching and pushing the positive applications of that as hard as we can, being aware of the negative kind of uses of those, being prepared to counter those. And 2, we need to make sure that the human is permanently connected. We cannot take the human out. Why? Because accountability lies in the human, not the machine. Right? So even when you put a mine in a harbor somewhere, which is still done, right? That's an autonomous device. Accountability kind of is retained by the human being. We just need to make sure that we never, ever, ever forget that. What does that look like in practice? It means that at any moment in time, a human being is essentially the authoritative kind of person, entity for the machine that's doing whatever it does, understands what discretion has been given to the machine, what envelope it's operating in, what the possible consequences are, and says, I sign up for that. I'm okay with that. That happens a lot with advanced machinery today, where you push a button and something happens. If you don't know what's going to happen when you push the button, that's danger, right? And that's particularly true with respect to AI. So I think that's the way forward on that. We shouldn't be afraid of it. We should recognize it's here, it's coming, and we should use it for good things while being aware that it's going to be used by the madding opposition for bad things. Connect the human inexorably. Yes, sir. We've met before.
Yes.
Yes. Several times. Yes.
So many questions, but one that is very relevant right here and now. In terms of regulation, all the regulatory that's the machinery that's set up already is directed at critical infrastructure, which is the end user. How do you, if you want to push that responsibility back to manufacturers, where's the regulatory framework for doing that? Which agency do you see it in?
It's going to be a variety of agencies. I'd say all of those kind of have some attachment to something that's critical or something that's used as a commodity and what's critical. If you find that you kind of have something that's so generic, so kind of so broad-based, then you might turn to NIST or the Department of Commerce to say, what are the fundamental characteristics that we would install this, or the Department of Homeland Security. Those are choices to be made, but there are some reasonable choices inside of that. But for the most part, what you find is that for everything that ultimately results in a critical function, there's already an agency on scene. And I don't know that we want to create another one in each of those cases. In some cases, there's already 10 on scene if you're in the financial sector. We need to rationalize and harmonize that. There is some discussion, a small discussion, but it will build into a larger thing in the implementation in the strategy that says, and we have to make sure that we attend to the unique nature of some of these critical sectors. And so that we, understanding that what looks like an anomaly in the electrical sector is a very different thing than what looks like an anomaly in the financial sector. And so there will likely then be a base kind of case, a base set of expectations and requirements, resilience and robustness, and then extending from that, probably tended to by those kind of on-scene regulators that, to your point, are today regulating operations as opposed to the foundational aspects of it. They take it the distance, kind of applying it to their specific sectors. So I see it as a combination of the two as opposed to a choice between the two.
Sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a GW business student as well as a lead account manager for a government IT contracting firm. So my question to you regarding the topic of regulations in AI, I want to ask, is the government ahead of innovations in terms of creating like regulations and policies? or is it behind? Like when their innovation happens, then the government creates regulation and policies regarding it. Do you
Are
think
you asking whether the government should be ahead or should be behind?
is it ahead or is it behind? And if it's behind, there is a security loophole in terms of the time when the policy is around. How do we tackle with that loopholes?
Yeah, so I bet, if I had to bet, that it's behind, hopefully slightly behind, as opposed to kind of in pace or ahead of that. Why is that? Because the innovation that is occurring in a highly distributed fashion is not wholly known, understood by the government, nor should it be wholly controlled or kind of dominated by the government. There'd be some things that don't have security or health, life, and safety critical applications, right? And the government should not be constraining and controlling innovation. It should, however, stand into its responsibility to ensure the health and welfare, right, the common defense of its citizenry, and ensuring that for those things that do have kind of that effect on society, that an elected government should stand in to say, I will ride herd on that. But it needs to take great care to not suppress innovation or constrain its kind of, its development in ways that are really an unalloyed good of a capitalist society, which allows the private sector to essentially flourish in ways that the government cannot wholly predict, nor should it. Right? We're not doing the kind of central planning that other societies might do. So we're probably slightly behind. As long as we're not kind of like just waking up, yesterday when tomorrow's underway, I think that could be something we can deal with. We've done it before.
Hi, Gary Korn, Tech Law and Security Program at Washington College of Law. Let me preface this by saying I think it is, one, congratulations on the whole process and the output, and long overdue that we start focusing on accountability for bringing to market these products and the implementation of these products, et cetera, that are creating negative externalities and risks. At the same time, in the strategy, there's a focus as needs to be on information sharing and public-private cooperation, because there needs to be situational awareness for the few, the many, the all at varying levels to be able to be responsible in this space. Is there any inherent tension, and how do you think through this, if so, between placing more emphasis on accountability and I can see the general counsels at every one of these entities starting to pull back a little bit, even more than has been the case over time because of concerns about cooperative information sharing and that accountability piece?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'll give you a somewhat kind of raw, unsophisticated answer. I think the centers of gravity for collaboration in the operational defensive system is going to be a slightly different place than the center of gravity for collaboration in terms of creating inherent resilience and robustness. Meaning that I think we can be more precise about the allocation of responsibility for those who produce, supply, who kind of deploy kind of capabilities into the supply chain. We can be more precise about what our expectations are and who's got to do what. And that's perhaps where there needs to be more emphasis on, we're going to be not discretionary about that. We're going to be quite specific about that. And we will hold you accountable. If you're in the business of creating, deploying cloud technology, then these are the requirements. The operational space, which you now take all of that assembled kind of material, and you then try to defend it, right, kind of in the theater of the real, that's somewhat more complicated. There are businesses in there whose business is, right, to help you defend that, right? You cannot ask them to give away all of their seed corn to profit people who aren't willing to pay for it, whether it's the government or some kind of set of customers. I know I've said that in a somewhat craven way. There are businesses that when they describe what's happening to them, they at the same time describe some vulnerability or perhaps some kind of insight into their competitive advantage. And that's an unfair hazard for them if they were asked to do that to the extreme. There are businesses in there that might generate a lot of noise and not a lot of helpfulness. And so you have to be somewhat more careful in that space to say, how do we actually establish a threshold? Start with a coalition of the willing that says, I'm willing to actually stand on a common floor plate and share my experiences because it might be the other end of the thing that you're experiencing. And then we're going to have to learn through an iterative process our way forward about what the right depth of the plow is there. I think what's happening at something called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative over at CISA is actually, it's a great example of how to do that. Right? They've got, I don't know how many companies now on that floor, 25 pretty significant companies who've said, I'm not sure I want to open my coffers to the government. That would be inappropriate in so many ways, might create agency in ways that are inappropriate. But I'm willing to put subject matter experts on the floor, not just policy wonks, but people who actually are kind of sleeves rolled up defending systems every day to say, I'm experiencing this. Does anybody else have anything to say about that? Can we compare and contrast so that what you're experiencing, what I'm experiencing fires a synapse that no one of us could have discovered alone? I'll just observe, right, that if in the middle of the Ukrainian conflict, Microsoft announces one day, there's a wiper virus coming over the near horizon, we've diagnosed it, we've kind of devised a patch, we've deployed that patch to the tune of hundreds of millions. Everyone is now held safe from what otherwise would have come over and eviscerated all of us. That could be a really good example of how do you take knowledge held by one person who can't action it because they're not actually in the seat that achieves leverage with that knowledge, give it to somebody else before the event, right, kind of in the near operational event, so that they can do something about it. That's, I think, the miracle that's happening in the operational phase. You got to beat all of us to beat one of us. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all formula there. What happens in the electrical sector, focused on the electrical grid, is going to be different than what happens in the financial sector. But there are some generics that take place in a place like the JCDC, which can be the common foundation for all of it. If that sounds too complicated by half, I think it is, right? But that's the nature of how you actually defend kind of physical infrastructure within the United States. There might be a hurricane rolling up the East Coast. There might be fires raging out on the West Coast. And you know how to deal with those using a collaborative approach in each case because you've developed local coalitions that say, we're actually, given the things that we do operationally that are unique to this locale, we know how to deal with it. I think that's the way forward. What I would say has been the sin of the past is that we have siloed all of that. Hey, you defend yourself based upon what knowledge you have, based upon what visibility you have inside your silo. Turns out you're looking at something that has a strand that goes into other silos, but I can't tell you that unless it fires inside of my silo as something that's a life critical event. And I then kind of take the time to push it over at the top and down into your silo, which is always time late. That is not going to work, right? Defending alone, being picked off one at a time is not going to work. Is that the question you've asked, Gary? Okay. Yes, ma'am. No question there. Over here.
My name is Ellie. I am a second year law part-time student. I recognize that a lot of the cyberspace concerns, especially with regards to national security, is tangible objects or tangible infrastructure. However, for me as a parent, my biggest concern is the erosion that the cyberspace has caused in the fabric of our society and has fomented a lot of animosity. And I was wondering, because you keep talking about the human aspect of technology, and I also believe it's absolutely the most important aspect. But can you speak more about how the strategy addresses that sense that we are turning against each other because of the use of the technology that is advancing so rapidly?
It's a really good question. So let me address it this way. Remember, I earlier alluded to a model that I carry around in my head about what's under assault in a kind of a cyber threat environment. And my own model, engineering me, kind of says that there are at least three levels. They're connected. But one is, data and the systems that process and present that data. That's under assault. And we've known about that for 40 years, frankly. We know how to defend confidentiality, integrity, availability. We just should do it, for goodness sake. We know how to do that. But that's really not the end game. Abstracted from that data and the systems are the development, delivery of critical functions, life critical functions, the electricity I talked about, the conduct of elections. And if you're going to defend that delivery of a critical function, you have to realize that it's about more than the data and the systems in that first level. It's about the collaboration that typically kind of conceives, develops, and delivers that. Elections are essentially done by the states and locales collaborating, at least loosely collaborating. A federal election is not done by the federal government, it's executed by the states. And if you're going to defend a federal election, which is highly distributed, you have to figure out what's the coalition that's actually doing that. How do I create common cause amongst that coalition? How do I give them access to perhaps the common threat information, access to technologies and practices that might help them? DHS and others have done a masterful job of that. That's why I think the elections that have occurred on even years in the last 6 years have gone well. Others might argue otherwise, but I think they've gone well. They have delivered the result that the people intended. But there's a third level, which gets to closer to what you've asked about, which is what I spoke of when I talked about the Colonial Pipeline attack, which is an attack on confidence, which is if we're not confident about what's happening in those first two layers, or if the information that's roiling across those two layers, remember what one dog says about the internet to another dog, nobody knows you're a dog, right? There's what, 10 billion persona in the internet, but there's only 7 billion people on the planet. You know, there's something going on top of that that's not quite right. And there's no gates or guards to kind of protect us against that divisive rhetoric and that divisiveness that essentially comes from that. Hold that thought. I'm going to tell another anecdote and then come back to main point. There was an article written by a guy named Reed Standish a few years ago, it might be now 5 years ago, but you can probably still find it. It's in Politico.com, the web version, I think. And he asked the following question. He said, why are the Finns not worried about Russians careening into their election the way we are? And he said there are 3 reasons. And one of them is not that the Russians aren't trying. He said that the first reason is that the Finnish government tends to be a joined up government. It's probably a parliamentary government, but it's a joined up government. They take great pains to say this is what we stand for. And they work that with the various stakeholders to say, this is actually our plan ahead, this is what we're going to do. And there's not some inherent division or divisiveness in that too. They place a very high premium on critical thinking skills. From the earliest days, if you're in school, you're not allowed to simply recite somebody else's opinion or facts. You have to give a representation of the convenient and inconvenient facts that are at your disposal. Kind of think your way through and demonstrate that you've actually done that to say, this is why I believe what I believe and it's defensible. And 3, they've got a lot of experience with Russians. So if you're a Russian, you got to do 3 things. You got to catch up to the Finnish government, not waiting to be picked apart. You got to get past the critical thinking, not easy to do. And you got to look like something other than a Russian. In many ways, we don't have those advantages here, right? We have the divisive rhetoric, which has actually been a feature for so much of our republic, where that conflict of ideas has led to a reconciliation that actually gets us to a place no one of those constituencies could have gotten to alone, but it's perhaps now an overdrive. We don't place the kind of premium on critical thinking skills. We believe absolutely that because I read it in fill in the news feed, that must be true, right? The depth of expertise is here and among us. You can study for 3 years at a law school, but somebody's going to Google the law principle that you're about to kind of expound upon, and you'll walk away saying, yeah, but I took like a 3-credit course in that. I wrote my dissertation on that. You just Googled it, right? That's not helping us, right? It might help us if it informs what questions we should ask, but we should be more careful in listening for the answers. So back to the model. If we get the first level right, we can defend data and systems. We can do the confidentiality, integrity, availability. If we get the second level right, we can actually kind of form coalitions to defend things that those coalitions develop and deliver. But that third level, an attack on confidence, you're not going to solve that third level by simply knocking down somebody else's idea. And the first 2 levels aren't going to guarantee that what happens on top of that is fair and appropriate. That battle is typically won by having a bigger, more powerful, more transcendent idea. It's generally won because your idea is better, it's more transcendent, it's more compelling than somebody else's idea. And I think that the reason that Abraham Lincoln and others kind of speak through the ages to us is they speak to all of us. They pass the museum test. He was speaking to me, right? And that's what we lack, right? We have this inherent divisiveness, which given the fact that the first 2 levels have not allowed us to tag who's who in the zoo, right, have made it such that we sometimes give kind of credence to a voice or an opinion in that space that is not fair, not appropriate. So my view, you need to get the first 2 levels right. Tag everybody in the zoo, not violating privacy, of course. But if 5 Russians can pretend to be 5,000 Americans, we should call that out. That is not right. That this is 5 Russians pretending to be 5,000 Americans. So that what then takes place on top of that is a continuation of this great American experiment, which is this conflict of ideas, where we bring critical thinking to the table, can actually aid and abet the flourishing, right, of some kind of reconciliation to a new and better kind of form of government. I think that's what lies before us. Right? The Russians, I don't think, in 16, 18, 20, and 22, were attempting to change a vote from column 1 to column 2. Now, this is a personal view, not a former national cyber director view. I don't think that was the game. I think what they were doing is trying to challenge our confidence that a society based upon a free and open set of principles and an architecture to match could essentially survive, thrive, and prosper in this day the way it did in times past. I bet they're wrong, but we have to do something at that third level that cyber can only create a playing field for, it can't deliver. Is that the question you've asked?
If I can probe you just a little further, I think the problem goes beyond having a foreign adversary.
It does. It does.
It
does.
Weakness. I think part of the problem is that when we unleashed this beast without knowing its capabilities, it's created a society where I can spend the entire day, if I want to, looking at a screen and not interact with the person next to me. And that, I think, is the grander problem.
I agree. So I've got a values card from the Office of the National Cyber Director, of which I am no longer a part, but I am an alumni, so I feel passionately about this. The front side, it's got a vision statement. It says it's not about the cybernet, it's not about cyberspace. It's to enable every individual to thrive and prosper in an equitable, safe, and resilient, interconnected world. Maybe too many words, but you get the gist of it. What's really important is on the backside, there are focus areas, like what are the lanes of effort that we're going to undertake to do that? That's an organizational design person's, perhaps some kind of dream field. But the values are really, 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 really important. Equity, inclusion, live it. Assume noble intent, lead with it. Collaboration, enable it. Innovation, foster it. Accountability, own it. Let me stop on that second one. Assume noble intent, lead with it. When somebody addresses me, whether it's at work or kind of in play, and they tell me something, I have to stop and freeze and frame to say, this person has noble intent. Now, they don't always have noble intent. They're not always deserving of my allocation to them of you have noble intent. But my experience is when you do the opposite, when you say, I know you're a rat bastard, that's a technical term, but I know you're a bad person, they almost always descend to meet it. When you say, no, I assume that you have noble intent. I think you're trying to do the right thing, and I'm going to try to get my head in your headspace to figure out what it is you're trying to do, and I will then meet you more than halfway. They almost always at least stop, pause, and think about rising to meet that occasion. They many times do rise to meet that occasion. We need to bring that degree, you might call it civility, back into our public discourse. We just need to get there from here, right? So, thanks. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of them say they want to be hackers. So my question for you is, how can we build the next generation value having educational?
Yeah, back to my earlier point about as we train coders who might all go off and do gaming, or they might go off and do hacking, how do we build in at the start, atomically bind to them a sense of their societal responsibility? To say this is not discretionary. If you're going to be a good citizen, then you're going to do it this way. We teach our kids that when they drive cars, like, hey, shouldn't speed. Why? Not because you get a ticket, you will, but because you'll injure someone, you'll hurt someone. And hopefully that's the message that we get across to them. And that can't simply be taught late in the game by somebody that's about to give them their certificate, and they ask them that standard question, like on a list of 1 to 2, right? You know, should you hurt people or not hurt people? Not hurt people. Excellent, you just passed. Right? Need to get that all the way back in the cultural norms that we establish. So part of that all many few strategy says, how do we actually kind of bring the cultural norms into those education programs to say, if you're a coder, even if you're building the simplest things, you have an inherent responsibility to ensure that if there is something reasonably foreseeable that could be used, that your code could be used to do, there's an inherent vulnerability that is well known, you know, widely understood. You have the responsibility to build that in, because your reputation will go with that code. And you'll then be the accountable party for, you know, where perhaps somebody failed to do something way upstream at the highest point of leverage. I think it's more a cultural phenomenon than it is something I could script and put into some regulation or some academic curricula. We should do all three, but if we don't get it culturally in the right place, back to the question asked over here of, I feel a responsibility to be a good citizen, to make a contribution to my society, then nothing else is going to work. It'd just be like fingers in the dike at that point in time. Do you have an answer to that question? Okay.
Okay.
Maybe one more, maybe two.
One more.
One more.
Yeah, I did. You've made a couple mentions of 5 Russians pretending to be 5,000 Americans, or that there are 10 billion people online and 7 billion people on Earth. What do you think of internet anonymity and privacy, and how do those tie into security in online spaces?
I think if you're engaged in a critical activity that affects the welfare, the health, safety of others, then you should be attributable. It should be something that you're then known for, tagged, and accountable for. If you're engaged in something that's completely superfluous, it's just a wild expression of ideas, and everybody in the room understands that, the proverbial room understands that, that's where privacy and anonymity, they have their play, they have their role. You cannot, should not penetrate the veil of privacy, the kind of the attribution or the allocation of privacy, right? Simply because you're interested in what those opinions are. But if they have a consequence, right, on others in society that is determinable, measurable, and kind of allocatable, then we should have attribution, right? So engineer signs off on a blueprint for a building, they put their name on that to say, not just have I brought my professional expertise to the design of this, but I'm now the accountable party to say that if this was flawed by design, you've got to come back to me. Right? There's an equivalent for that in cyberspace. But short of that, then we shouldn't be vicariously trying to expose privacy entities. So that makes sense? Oh, great. All right, I think we are at the end.
I know, unfortunately, we are out of time.
I'll stay after if anybody wants to ask a question in the forum.
Yeah, I think you can tell from this incredible audience engagement that this was so compelling. We got you for 90 minutes. I think we could have kept you for a lot longer than that, but unfortunately we have to call it. We have a little gift for you, which is a GW Law Padfolio. And I just want to thank you for all of these comments and for your service, because not just the cyber strategy, but all of your work for our country is something that we all very deeply.
Thanks for that. There's a person in the room that isn't serving in some way, shape, or form in this larger cause, right? Again, back to the question of who among us is kind of in some way, shape, or form involved in creating cyber resilience, sustaining that cyber resilience for society that is massively interconnected, everyone in the room. So I'm just pleased to be one of you. So,
let me give him a round.